Welcome to a live edition of Pensari Basketball. We are sitting here at 6 a.m. and we're going to talk a little bit about veteran leadership. Look, there's a lot about basketball that has been explored more in depth recently than it has been at any point in perhaps NBA history. I think the average NBA fan understands far more about what types of players impact winning versus, the concept of two-way players, players who impact the box score beyond the box score. I think these topics have been expanded upon by podcasts like Thinking Basketball. And I think the average fan now can understand that, hey, 20 points per game is not just 20 points per game. There's other ways to impact the game. But I think one of the perhaps parts of basketball that is still very unexplored and perhaps needs greater exploration is team dynamics, chemistry. And I wanted to take a look back at 4 rosters in Raptors history, which I was most fond of as a fan. And I wanted to sort of point to what those rosters had in common and why I think what the Raptors are doing today with the signing of Garrett Temple and really over the last 24 months, maybe last 18 months, Thaddeus Young, Otto Porter Jr., Jakob Poeltl, these types of players, and what exactly the benefit is to having a sizable portion of your roster devoted to players like this. So if you're new around here, please hit subscribe. Of course, this is an impromptu live. It's at 5:55, 6 o'clock in the morning. I don't expect a lot of people to tune into this live, but hopefully you're able to catch this later on during the day as you're, catching up with, I don't know, your morning coffee or whatever. So yeah, I'm having my morning coffee and let's get to it. So my first roster that I will bring up is the 2000-2001 roster. I think a lot of people might be a little young to remember this roster, but this is a rookie Morris Peterson, and look, there's there are guys who are veterans in year 3, and then there are guys who are children in year 13. And I think that we can pretty much, sum it up with, do you have a desire to lead? Are you that type of person, right? And you look at someone like, who comes to mind? Dale Davis. Dale Davis comes to mind. Charles Oakley, guys like this. You take a look at guys like this and just throughout league history. CJ McCollum is a great example. Garrett Temple is a great example. Gennaro Pargo. Like, there's so many guys that I can think of just off the top of my head. Aaron McKee. Aaron McKee is a great guy. If you remember, the Sixers team that went to the finals, Aaron McKee was a really big part of that. Eric Snow was a really big part of that. These types of guys have sort of weirdly been phased out of the league. And I can't really explain why, other than the fact that it's really hard if you're a general manager to see the value of a guy who's 34 years old, isn't a star, isn't a marquee name, doesn't really impact the game the way he once used to. You don't really have a use for him. So why not? Why not take a flyer on a lottery burnout? Why not burn that roster spot on a Killian Hayes or a Anthony Bennett? And I think this is the impact of NBA 2K. When we are playing my GM mode in NBA 2K, who's the guy that we sign from the undrafted heap? We go right to the youngest player with the highest potential, and we sign them. We often avoid signing the 38-year-old vet who's over the hill. And there is a difference. There is a complete difference between signing a guy like Tracy McGrady or Pau Gasol at the end of their career versus, signing a guy who has literally made a career of being a journeyman, a role player. I spent the last hour listening to a very interesting podcast with Garrett Temple and CJ McCollum, 2 guys who completely fit this mold. CJ, of course, being the better player and the guy who's sort of been a primary option in the NBA, and Garrett being more the example of how to do it the other way. And it was interesting just listening to them talk about the value of role players, the value of veterans, the value of buying into your role. And I think if you look at these 4 rosters that I'm going to flash for you, the first being the 2001 Raptors, the next being the 2007 Raptors, then the 2014 Raptors, then the 2019 Raptors. It's kind of funny how it just works like this. right? Every 5 years, it's like they figure it out that this is what they're supposed to do. So you look at a team like this, who sticks out? Charles Oakley, 15-year vet, right? Kevin Willis, 15-year vet. Mark Jackson, 13-year vet. Del Curry, 14-year vet. Tyrone Corbin, Muggsy Bogues. Like, this is one of the older rosters in the NBA. But who's on this roster? Vince Carter, Morris Peterson. You look at the young players on this roster and tell me, did they develop? Right? Did Vince go on and, become a consummate professional? Hell yes, he did. Keon Clark, yes, he battled his demons. He had a really good year, right? He played really well for a second-year player. He blossomed, right? Morris Peterson, another guy who just went on and had like this really long career. Alvin Williams, he did well. Tracy McGrady, prior to this season, was on this team. He also did well. And a lot of the veterans, these guys who are, doing the tutelage, the teaching, I think that they were very crucial in that. The second example I'll give you is the 2006-2007 Raptors. This is a very surprising team, right? This was a team that was absolutely awful the year before, like truly terrible, right? And by the way, the 2000-2001 Raptors, this is the first time the Raptors made it to the second round in franchise history. This is prior to, the year before they got bounced by the New York Knicks in the first round. So this is the team that made it over the hill. And I just want to say, quick, just to dance back and forth on this, how did that roster come together? You look at Antonio Davis. Who was the player that went out for Antonio Davis? Marcus Camby. Backwards. Jonathan Bender, right? And then for Charles Oakley, it was Marcus Camby. You cannot tell me that at that age, Charles Oakley was worth Marcus Camby, right? You cannot. Marcus Camby went on to be an all-defensive type of guy. He was a very big part of that 8-seed New York Knicks team that went to the finals. And yes, you as the Raptors, you made a concession, like you made a trade for experience. And why did you do that? Because this was something that was very commonplace back then. Having vets in the locker room was considered, a pretty much a staple of any good organization. If you wanted to have a good organization, you wanted the young guys to develop, you got vets. Unless, you wanted to be the 2021, 2022, or 2022, 2023 Houston Rockets, right? And so, it's really difficult to then take, you consider even a team like the Sacramento Kings, right? Last year, look at their turnaround. Who are the guys that are really instrumental in turning that ship around? Apart from Mike Brown and Jordi Fernandez, obviously as coaches coming in and shifting the tone, you had players who finally bought in, right? It's not De'Aaron Fox. It's not De'Aaron Fox just turning it around. And, it's Domantas Sabonis. It's a guy who's like that. Like, he might still be a young player. He's still 26, 27 years old. But, man, that guy has carried himself. I remember Domantas Sabonis when he was 17, and he was carrying himself like a 5-year NBA vet at that age. So he's always been that remarkably mature, composed type of person. You have Harrison Barnes, another guy who's like that. Kevin Huerter. Again, he's young, but he's like that. Keegan Murray, he's a rookie, but he's like that too. He's kind of like a put team over eye, do the right thing all the time, have solid work ethic, just have a general composure about you. And again, this is what I'm saying. Like, you could have, a fourth-year player who's capable of fulfilling this role, or maybe you need a 14th-year guy to do that. It could be a Thaddeus Young, who is, 35 years old, or it could be, Jakob Poeltl, who's 26. And I assure you that both of them are cut from the same cloth of selflessness and team first, and having difficult conversations when they need to be had, and showing players how to be professionals in the NBA, because these are not guys, who have necessarily carved their niche by being stars. And this is so important for players like Christian Koloko, players like Precious Achiuwa, who maybe only see, Pascal Siakam as the only reasonable outcome of what they could be. And therefore, there's no buy-in. If that's not my role, then what's the buy-in? How do you convince a guy like Gary Trent Jr., whose father was, in fact, this type of role player, that he doesn't need to be a 20-point per game scorer to impact winning. How do you explain to a Precious Achiuwa that, he can impact the game while being a fifth option on the court and playing within himself on offense? How do you, look at Delano Banton last year. I think this was a great example of, a rudderless ship, right? And you look at this team that we're talking about, 2006, 2007. I mean, yeah, you don't see a lot of veterans on this team. There's a lot of rookies. Jorge Garbajosa is a rookie. But man, that guy was a veteran if there ever was one. I remember hearing stories about, how he guided Andrea in that first year, even though they were both rookies technically, and they both made, I think, rookie all first team, second team. Jorge had so much, experience playing over in Europe, and he just really carried himself like a professional. And, you had guys like Derek Martin, Rasha Nesterovic, and Anthony Parker, fresh off of winning EuroLeague MVP. And, Morris Peterson, a 6-year guy, but he'd been through the grind. He wasn't that old at that point, but he was I think he was a 3 or 4 year college player. So he was like approaching 30 here in his 6th year, right? So, I mean, he was an adult. PJ Tucker is an example of a guy who didn't know how to do this. Like, he didn't know how to figure it out. He wanted touches. He wanted a role. Jose Calderon, again, a guy who in his first year, I mean, he was now entering his 2nd year, was already like a vet. Like, this was a guy like TJ Ford, maybe, hadn't completely figured it out, but you look at this roster and you see absolutely why they were successful. You had a lot of guys who bought into their roles. It bled off like osmosis. And, a guy like Jorge Garbajosa, when he talks, you listen, right? He's done that. You can tell by talking to him that he really understands the game. Rasha Nesterovic, just a guy who had carved out a role as being a 5th option, and he didn't want to be anything more than that. And I think that that's so important. Then the next roster that comes to mind, and of course, like, I apologize that these rosters are sort of laid out like totality, like even the players that you traded away are still on this team. But you see the benefit of trading a guy like Rudy Gay, who ironically went on later to become this type of veteran, and getting back, a player like Chuck Hayes or Gravis Vasquez or Patrick Patterson or John Salmons, just getting some adults in the room to sort of, bolster that team, right? Steve Novak, like, these are all guys who, like, look, man, like, most of the guys who make it to the NBA, I mean, if I showed you what Patrick Beverley averaged in high school, like, you would be shocked, right? Everyone comes in thinking they're going to be a 25-point per game guy. Most people are not. Most people are not going to be 25-point per game guys. Most people are not going to be 20-point per game guys. And so you need to find another way to be successful on the court. And sometimes that means taking no shots. Sometimes that means scoring 2 points, 3 points a game, but doing what's necessary for your team. That is such a crucial skill set, and just something that a lot of young players never figure out because they've only played one way, and maybe they have, their eye on the prize. And look, man, one of the consequences of player empowerment is it's really difficult for coaches to have this conversation with a player, right? Imagine you're Darko Rajakovic and you need to tell Precious Achiuwa that in order for us to be successful, my friend, you need to set screens, dive to the basket, play without the basketball, and cut out all this other stuff. Hit open shots. You have to be that guy. In order for Gary Trent, like, you might have to convince this guy, like, to come off the bench. I don't know if he's coming off the bench or if he's starting. You might need to, really rein in someone like OG Anunoby, who has higher aspirations or whatever, and maybe show him that Kawhi is not the only model for the type of player you can be. And when you look at a guy like Garrett Temple, or you look at a guy like Udonis Haslem, or you look at a guy like Dale Davis, Antonio Davis, Gennaro Pargo, Aaron McKee, you look at these guys, you see a different path to success than the one that you are currently on. Now, the tough realization for a lot of young players, and this conversation needs to happen at some point with most young players, is I'm going to present you with 2 options. Mr. Basketball in Iowa, Mr. Basketball in Florida, whatever the hell you were prior to getting to the league. You're not there anymore, Kansas. Like, you're not there anymore, Dorothy. This is not Kansas anymore. Maybe this is a conversation that you need to have with Grady Dick at some point. Maybe because he's been the guy in high school. He's, and ironically, he's not. You're not going to need to have this conversation with him because he completely bought in at Kansas. He was completely a guy who had zero issues not being the guy. He played off the ball. He's extremely unselfish. So I think it's a weird thing to say that your 19-year-old rookie possibly has more maturity and sense of self and composure and a bigger picture view than some of your veterans last year. But I think it's completely possible that he does, right? It comes down to how you've been coached. It comes down to how you've been raised. And it just comes down to your mindset. But it's difficult for someone like Darko Rajakovic to go up to a Gary Trent in a contract year and say, hey, man, I'm going to need you to be a fourth option. I can't have you hijacking this offense. This offense is going to be predicated around, Pascal and Scotty. I just need you to buy into this role. And for Gary to be like, well, how's that supposed to get me paid? Well, Garrett Temple is a great example of how to have a 15-year NBA career. His own father is a great example of how to have a 15-year NBA career. And I think that sometimes when you see somebody that you admire, right, that you respect, who's buying into a role that you are rejecting, subconsciously, it triggers a herd mentality of let me get in line, right? I think the problem with the Raptors last year obviously was, your leaders had no actual interest in leading. And I know that sounds like a very scathing indictment of Pascal Siakam and Fred VanVleet, but I genuinely listened to these guys all year, 2 years actually, talk about their thoughts on leadership. And it just felt like it's not my job. Someone else will do it. And the problem is nobody did it. And I think that the Raptors, there's this old saying that in order to shake yourself out of apathy, like you need dramatic examples. I think last year was a dramatic example, and I think it has shaken the Raptors out of apathy. The fourth example in terms of rosters that really evoke this sense of like well-roundedness, the Toronto Raptors, it says 2006, 2007. I apologize. It should say 2018, 2019. And this roster, of course, with a totally over himself Marc Gasol, a totally over himself Danny Green, a totally over himself Serge Ibaka, a totally over himself Kyle Lowry. Like these are all vets. Those were all vets, right? Guys who bought into their roles. So now if those guys are buying into their roles, well, Fred VanVleet, I better not hear you talking about how many shots you're getting. And, OG Anunoby, I better not hear you utter a peep about the fact that you're not playing. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like, if you look up to somebody who's doing something, like, I think that this is such a underrated part of team culture, team building, organizational structure, is you absolutely need somebody to set the marching orders, and it can't always be your coach. Because again, in an age of player empowerment, and the salaries are just so staggering, so huge, that it's so common for teams where a player, maybe a star player or an all-star, can simply go up to management and say, I'm going to demand a trade if you don't fire this guy. So he's coaching me up. But that creates such a horrible thing because most people don't want to be coached in a way that hurts their stats or that hurts themselves. And there's this feeling, that you have with guys like DeMarcus Cousins or Zion Williamson, or that there was never really a buy-in to what is my role as the best player on this team? Do I need to do anything beyond score 25 points per game? Right. And it's the guys who figure out that, yes, there is a bigger task at hand than 25 points per game. There's, leadership, there's, managing sort of the pulse of the team, understanding, the dynamics within the team. It's that element and that know-how that the veteran can then guide the younger player. You know what I mean? So Garrett Temple can have that conversation with Scotty Barnes and be like, hey, man, like, I think you need to talk to Precious. I think you need to talk to Gary. This is super important And even if they don't necessarily ask him to do it, just him watching them do it is going to set into motion an idea of this is what I got to do when I step into that role. One of my mentors in university wrote a book on corporate governance and the nature of constructing a board of directors. And he talked about diversity. Now, I know diversity is sort of a token buzzword in, where we are in modern society. But I think that diversity should mean and can mean much more than just, okay, one person is black, one person is white, one person is Asian. I think it means a diversity of aspirations, diversity of backgrounds, a diversity of everything. I mean, where Garrett Temple is coming from in his life, and I implore you to, look up where he's coming from, where Otto is coming from in his life, where he is in his life. These guys are fathers, right? These guys are husbands. You have to understand that this has a very strong impact on younger players, right? Who are then aspiring to do that. You need some guidance here, and it can't just come from the coaches. And you start talking about, players like Dennis Schroder, guys like this, guys who've, been around, like they have some lessons to be able to impart. But more importantly, they've obviously stuck around despite not being superstars. They have carved out career paths that are different than Fred and Pascal, right? They've been role players, they've been bench players, they have bought in. So they have like a range of experiences that they can then just say, hey, I went through that. I also went through that. I was on the bench too. I got cut. I went to the G League. This is weirdly always been a part of Masai Ujiri teams ever since the We the North era started. But I think last year, the year before, is kind of when it backfired because the guys that you expected to be like humble leaders kind of turned into prima donnas. And I think the whole thing kind of fell apart. But when you look at the moves that Masai Ujiri and Bobby Webster have made ever since really last trade deadline, bringing in Thaddeus Young, then bringing in Otto Porter, then bringing in Jakob Poeltl, now bringing in Garrett Temple. Like you are aging up this roster significantly. Significantly. Why? Because every single player that I just mentioned contributes to winning beyond scoring. Every one of them. None of these guys have the aspiration to be all-stars. None of these guys have aspirations of max contracts. None of these guys are going to complain if you put them on the bench. None of these guys are going to, are afraid to share their thoughts with a younger teammate. And all of these guys are respectful. And when you listen to them talk, you can really get a feel. If you're a half decent person, you can get a feel for how having a person like this after a tough loss or in the midst of a losing streak or when there's a bit of a conflict on a team, how someone like this can be a bit of a stabilizing force within the locker room. So, you start looking back at these rosters. These are not the best players. They just aren't. Like I think having Derek Martin on the team drove a lot of people absolutely crazy. Landry Fields. I think Landry Fields is a very underrated part of that 2013, 2014 team, right? Just as a guy, you see who he has become. Like I just want you to realize Anthony Parker is now a general manager, okay, for the Orlando Magic. Landry Fields is now a general manager, I believe, or president or general manager for the Atlanta Hawks. Like, these general managers were on your roster in their 20s, right? And that leadership that eventually propelled them into becoming general managers, or, for other guys, it's coaches over in Europe or whatever. This leadership intangible, that was actually present. So, look, there's obviously going to be some contingent of Raptor fans that are still going to be like, but Garrett Temple is trash. and Thaddeus Young is washed, and you just don't need guys like this. And I would say that to measure their impact by their numbers is not always going to be accurate or fair. I think you probably don't get to measure the impact that these guys have for another 4 or 5 years until you see what type of impact they've had on Scotty, until you see what kind of impact they have on OG, until you see what kind of impact they have on Grady Dick. And I think, maybe even Pascal Siakam. I mean, he's 29 years old, but there's no reason that he can't grow further, right? I mean, you look up and down this roster, and if you believe, like if you genuinely believe that Scotty, OG, Grady, like these three guys especially, but you can include Gary Trent Jr. into that mix as well, Precious Achiuwa, Christian Koloko. If you believe that these are young players who can be real players in the NBA, like all of them are starters, like all of them are really good players, then you have a very solid basis within reason to be investing in veterans who can help them maximize their potential. At the end of the day, yes, there are still teams that are going to look like AAU squads. They are. The thought process those general managers have, whether it be Sam Presti or Raphael Stone or whoever, and I know I just named one of the best general managers, one of the worst general managers in the league, but the idea that those guys have is, well, at some point, one of these guys can pop. The question I ask is, then what? What do you do when that guy pops? You look at a guy like Joel Embiid, right? You look at a guy like James Harden. You look at a guy like Kyrie Irving. These are three guys who came up on really young rosters, okay? Now, when people are making this debate about whether veteran leadership is important, they often look at, well, did anyone pop? And if someone popped without veteran leadership, well, veterans are overrated. Look, Kevin Durant became an MVP, and look how young his squad was. Okay. Well, here's the question that I would like to ask you. Has Kevin Durant won a championship outside of Golden State, which was the ultimate veteran-laden system, right? You had like solid vets in Steph's rookie year, Steph's second year, third year, right? Look at Russell Westbrook. Look at Carmelo Anthony over in Denver, right? That was a pretty young roster, and then they made it worse by bringing in Allen Iverson. You look at a Joel Embiid. What is the consequence of the process? Now, yeah, he became a fantastic player through hard work. Congratulations. What type of leader is he? What type of winner is he? Right? You compare that to someone like Jimmy Butler, who came up with guys like Joakim Noah and Derrick Rose. Like, you look at those Bulls teams and you will see veterans. Vince Carter became a great veteran. Who were his veterans? The transfer of knowledge, leadership, mentorship, it's not easy to gauge year to year. And so we often throw out the baby with bathwater and just say it's completely irrelevant because so-and-so player developed without it. I tell you, whether Cade Cunningham, Franz Wagner, Paolo Banchero, Jalen Green, Josh Giddey, whether these guys develop or not, I don't care. Like, I'm sure, to some extent they will. What I want to know is, what type of franchise player will you be when you eventually do develop? Will you be the Anthony Davis, not my fault, not my problem type of leader? Are you going to be the DeMarcus Cousins type of leader? Are you going to be the Joel Embiid type of leader? Or are you going to be the Jason Tatum type of leader? Are you going to be, the Jimmy Butler type of leader? Because there is a big difference. There's a huge difference. And I think if you want to, look down the league and just find like dysfunctional roster, go start looking at the rosters that those players had when they were rookies and second years players. I'm not saying it's a perfect science. I'm just saying there's an absolute correlation between the type of player you will become and the veterans you have in your first 2 to 3 years. Now, this can go the other way too. You have very selfish vets. If you have very selfish vets who are constantly thinking about money, constantly thinking about themselves over the team, well, guess what? Now you are going to have a lot of that on your roster being transferred to the young players. It's like a virus. It's very much like a virus because ideas have that sort of viral quality, right? If you have a player like you consider Pascal Siakam, right? What he did last year, kind of, betting on himself, trying to get all NBA, et cetera, right? Precious Achiuwa saw him do that. Scotty Barnes saw him do that. OG Anunoby saw him do that. Everyone saw him do that, right? Everyone saw him come out. And you might admire it. You might defend it. You might condemn it. I don't really care. I'm not here to make a moral judgment on it. But I am saying for him to put his stats, his status, his contract above necessarily team success, that this wasn't a Tim Duncan, Manu Ginobili sort of like, I'll do whatever it takes as long as it's resulting in winning, a Kyle Lowry, I'll take 5 shots if it means we win. The priority shifted from winning to contract. So now when Precious Achiuwa comes up for a contract year, who is he likely to mimic? Who is he likely to replicate? Who is he likely to emulate? That becomes the problem. So for the Raptors, the only reason that I can see that they have just absolutely gone haywire in terms of restructuring this team, restructuring this culture, talking about culture shift, talking about all these things. The one thing that I can see as, this was the impetus or the motivation for this is they wanted to nip this in the bud. That they saw where this was going. They saw how quickly it can get out of hand, how quickly. And it's not surprising to me that a lot of guys are just gone. That they're just Delano Banton gone. Like maybe he absorbed too much of that. Maybe that sort of bet on yourself, mentality has sort of bled into a lot of players. And I know that this can border on, cringy or conspiratorial for some people, but just think about it in a work culture. If you have an office like that you work at and your boss is always late, always angry, never accountable, never holds himself accountable or herself accountable, at what point does their assistant, do their managers, do their staff start adopting that mentality? Now you can remove the boss and bring in a new boss, which is what the Raptors did, moving from Nick Nurse to Darko Rajovic. But at some point, that boss is completely outnumbered, right? So at some point, you need to bring a lot of people in from the outside who haven't necessarily been influenced. And hopefully, that way you save everybody, because now Delano Banton has to go to Boston. He's going to have a completely different type of leader. The organization is completely different. He's going to be hearing from Al Horford and Jason Tatum, and this is completely different messaging than Fred and Pascal. And hopefully, the Delano Banton and Justin Champagnie thrive in Boston. And I see no reason why they wouldn't, because they have solid vets. So anyways, I think what I would like for this video to hopefully result in is that you can't always look at 2 players and compare them one versus one. You can't just say, well, Garrett Temple is, and look, I'm a big Joe Wieskamp fan. I like the guy a lot, right? Made a video about him, a profile video about him. I obviously like him a lot. You cannot compare Garrett Temple and Joe Wieskamp one versus one and say, well, one guy is 23 years old and the other guy is 37 and the Raptors made a huge mistake. You can't do that. You really can't, because all of those intangible qualities that Garrett could potentially help Grady become better. Like, what I'm trying to say is, if you don't think that this young player who's not playing has star or superstar potential, and you certainly could be wrong, but I very much doubt that Joe Wieskamp is going to be more than a role player in the NBA. He'd be very lucky to replicate Garrett Temple's entire career, like 14, 15 years. He'd be very lucky, right, to replicate that, given where his career is right now. So whether he pops or not is not really relevant. If he goes and catches on with the team next year and, pulls the whole Yuta Watanabe type of resurrection, it won't really matter, right? Unless he goes and becomes a star or something, this shouldn't be something that bothers you overly. But I can understand just psychologically looking at these players one against one and saying, what does Garrett Temple do better? Is he a better defender? Is he a better athlete? No. Is he a better shooter? No, probably not. So what is it that he does? Well, he's in a different point in his life. That's what he does better. And if you run a simulation and one team has Garrett Temple as their 15th man, who plays maybe a grand total of 18 minutes all year, and Joe Wieskamp, where he plays 18 minutes all year, I guarantee you Joe Wieskamp would probably be more effective in those 18 minutes. But those 18 minutes become completely inconsequential when you start figuring out those plane rides, those bus rides, those locker room huddles, those timeouts. All of that other stuff outweighs the 18 to 25 to 45 to maybe 200 minutes maximum if you're ravaged by injuries that these two players are going to play. And so the end result becomes, getting rid of clutter. I also want to say development is, to some extent, a limited resource. You only have so many hours to put into development for a staff. You only have so many people. Like in theory, obviously, you'd be like, well, why can't you develop 15 guys all at once, like NBA 2K? It's just not the reality of how things work, right? You need to get guys reps. You need to have coaches who can work with those players on specific things. So now, by eliminating some of these fringier prospects and replacing them with veterans who are sort of, well-oiled machines and just have their regimen, and you don't really need necessarily Darko Rakovic and, John Mashalela and Pat Delaney working with Otto Porter necessarily. I mean, they can talk to him, obviously, but you're not going to need dedicated support for Otto and Thad, right? I think that kind of helps, right? Christian Koloko becomes the young center on the roster. Precious Achiuwa becomes the young power forward on the roster. There is a clear pathway for all of these guys now to ascend up. There's a clear pecking order. There's a clear structure, support structure for all of these players. So anyways, not to ramble off, this video has already gone 37 minutes, and I doubt that I have, probably even added 10 minutes of actual value into this. But I just thought that it's just something that when I read so-and-so, why didn't we sign so-and-so, etc., I'm just reminded that, look, at the end of the day, there are intangible benefits that you're not going to be able to read on the box score or an analytics sheet. But I think that a team with Garrett Temple is better than a team without Garrett Temple, regardless of how much he plays or how well he shoots. Because I think that he transfers a lot of good ideas in a locker room. I think he provides a ton of stability. I think he provides a model for players that is, I think he provides a counterbalance. I think he provides an extension of the coaching staff. And I mentioned it before that player empowerment is just this strange phenomenon in the NBA where players are younger and richer than ever, right, in the league. It makes it very difficult. And you really don't want to be setting up someone like Darko Rakovic, who's already a bit of an outsider coming in to a new situation, to a new city as a first-time head coach. The coaching staff is extremely young, and there is no, Mike Brown. There's no finals experience. There's no, you know what I mean? There's finals experience with Jama Mashalela, twice, but there's no guy who commands the room necessarily. Do you know what I mean? All of these guys are a little bit unproven. So you needed really solid vets, and I'm really happy they got one. Anyways, talk to y'all later. Have a great day. Peace. And make sure to hit subscribe. Chuck Hayes with the Warriors right now. Yes, that is true. You look at a guy like even Popeye Jones. You know what I mean? This was another guy who just, you always saw him at the end of the bench, and you're like, what does that guy do? What does he do? And there are veterans. I tell you, there are veterans who are I don't know, 32, 33 years old. they don't do shit for you at the end of the bench, right? If they don't play, they sulk. If you don't engage them, they disengage from the team. Like they're not, I want to say they're not professionals. You know what I mean? Like you're hoping as a staff, as an organization, that you grow people into these roles, right? You were hoping probably that Chris Boucher to this point right now would be able to do some of what Otto and Thad are doing. That's not his nature. That's not his personality. That's not what anything I've seen from him, right? That's not to say that he's a negative or anything like that, but it's just like that wherewithal of going around the league, like Garrett Temple was talking about, like having been, I think, on 13 different teams, and he was in the G League. He's played in Italy. You look at a guy like PJ Tucker, like these guys, they get paid a ton of money and they're not very good at basketball. Why? It's, and by saying they're not very good at basketball, I mean relative to, some of the star players or players who are commanding the salaries that they're commanding, usually they're not as good. I don't know. In a weird way, you're almost eliminating competition, right? Garrett Temple is not going to play for the Raptors. He's not going to be in the rotation. There's not a chance that he's going to be in the rotation, and there's not a chance that he's going to sulk about it. So if he's not going to sulk about it, maybe it makes it okay for Malachi Flynn to kind of look at what he's doing and be like, maybe I just need to stay committed and stay working, because Garrett Temple, who is, showing me right now that there's a different way for me to make $100 million, right? Because at the end of the day, it's about taking care of your family. If you want to be a professional basketball player, there are different ways to do it. If you only ever hear about the one way to do it, which is get the bag, get the one big bag, I mean, some people are not going to get the big bag. So you're going to have to make a choice as a young player like Malachi Flynn, Precious Achiuwa, Christian Koloko. Door number one, you are going to be out of the league in 4 years. Do you want to take that door? No? Okay, here's door number two. Door number two is you're going to be a role player. You're going to be a winner. You're going to be a guy who puts the team first. You're going to be a mentor for younger players. You're going to be a player who is guiding young players. And you're going to have a 14-year career because people are going to love you. And you're probably going to make 180 to $250 million doing that. Maybe 300 million in the current NBA. That's important. This is important. If you inflation adjust Garrett Temple's career earnings, I assure you, it's like if you cap adjust and inflation adjust a 15-year career in the NBA for a reasonable role player now, he would be able to probably convince someone like Precious Achiuwa, hey man, you're probably broke right now, right? You're borderline broke. Like after taxes and everything, Precious Achiuwa, like he is probably close to maybe at $1 million net worth, right? How would you like to retire in 15 years with $200 million net worth? Let me show you how to do that. Thaddeus Young is the guy who can show people how to do that. Otto Porter, like all these guys have made tons of money. They have big houses. They have nice cars. And obviously, if you're a young player who's kind of, struggling, wondering when your next contract is going to come, these guys are showing you that there's a completely different way to do this. And I think that that's super important. Anyways, talk to y'all later. Have a good one and peace.